So a living wage is not the same as a minimum wage. They are similar in intention, however. The idea is that people have enough to live. But in practice, they're different because minimum wages are set by governments. They are often subject to political processes. They often are negotiations between different parties. A living wage, on the other hand, they're usually researched by specialist organizations that are not subject to political processes. And so what you end up having is, even though they have the same intention, in practice, you can get very different numbers. In fact, is in most countries around the world, a minimum wage is not enough to meet a decent standard of living. So a minimum wage usually is not a living wage. There are a few exceptions, but it's usually the case that it's not the same. Sometimes you'll hear the term market wage or market-based wage. This is simply when companies go into the market and do research into what's generally paid. Maybe they take an average. For low-level jobs, this is usually irrelevant. This is more relevant for higher paid jobs, for executives, for example, where they're trying to remain competitive in the industry and they're doing market research to make sure that they're not paying less than the competitors. A market wage does not need to be a living wage. A market wage could be lower than a living wage. Then we have living income, which is pretty much the same as a living wage. The only difference is, and it's kind of in the name, a living wage is for a waged employee, so what an employer pays to an employee. Living income is when you have either freelancers or entrepreneurs that are not in an employment status. So for example, a cocoa farmer in Ghana, they will have their own farm. They're not employed by anyone. So there we talk about living income. But the idea behind it is the same, that they should earn enough for them and their families. You might have heard the term fair wage or fair wages. Generally speaking, this is a more loosely used term, more loosely than living wage, which has more of a tight definition. Fair wage is often more broad in concept and can include paying a living wage, can include fair wage structure. So for example, the balance between bonuses and base pay. It can also include things like fair wage setting processes. So how did you determine what the wage is being paid? Do you have job descriptions that are linked to skills, that are linked to job categories or salary ranges? And lastly, and this is a very important one, collectively bargained wage. So sometimes you'll hear reference to collective bargaining agreement. This is when a workers' union essentially negotiates with either management of a company or even a whole sector. They essentially negotiate to determine wages and working conditions. Doesn't exist in all countries, depends a little bit on what part of the world you're in as well. Now, in theory, a collectively bargained wage should be a living wage because people know their costs, they get to negotiate, and surely they would negotiate to cover their own and their family's costs. In practice, it doesn't always work like this, essentially because of power asymmetries. So actually not just power asymmetries within between a union and the employer, but also, for example, market dynamics. With COVID, there's more pressure on jobs, and there might be a situation where workers find it harder to negotiate. So in practice, collectively bargained wages don't always equate to a living wage. I want to take a moment to reflect on this question we have on our screen. Who has the minimum wage jobs? Who has the jobs that pay a minimum wage? And another way of asking this question, who's paid below a living wage? Because as we mentioned before, oftentimes a minimum wage is below a living wage. Who's got those jobs? Think about your friends and family maybe. Who are they? Also think about society. What kind of people have those jobs? And I'll just give you a moment to think about that. What kinds of people, what kinds of roles are you thinking of? So the ones that come to my mind, people in low-skilled work, blue-collar workers, women, racial and ethnic minorities, economic migrants, people with disabilities, generally speaking, people with less choice and flexibility in life. So you can see where I'm going with this. Those who have these jobs are often marginalized people. So there's a very close link between living wage and JEDI. And that's, I don't know if anyone noticed, that's why there's that picture on the screen. That was a little clue. And this goes two directions. When we talk about JEDI, oftentimes a tool to advance JEDI is living wage, because implementing a living wage targets these marginalized groups of people. The other way around, when talking about living wage and wanting to address living wage gaps, you also need to be cognizant of JEDI principles. So a company, for example, that has operations in multiple countries, they are now paying the minimum wage and they want to pay a living wage. Well, who do you prioritize? That's when the JEDI principles become important, because you need to know who you're focusing on and why. Next, we're going to look at how much is enough. So we know we just spoke about living wage and why it's important. Let's all assume that everyone on this call agrees, yes, it's a good thing to go for. Then there's a question, and it's a question often asked by companies, okay, well, how much do I actually need to pay? So here we talk about benchmarks. So essentially benchmarks refers to the data, the living wage data for a particular place in a particular time. Now, the way to think about benchmarks is that benchmarks refers to the benchmark data. You have a benchmark provider. So actually, I should be saying that these are benchmark providers. And they're usually civil society organizations or NGOs that essentially do research in their particular market, and they have this calculation and they produce this living wage figure. Now, there are quite a lot of benchmark providers out there. That's part of the exciting thing about that we're doing this work now, is that we actually have quite a lot of benchmarks out there. Now, the flip side is that it's getting a little bit confusing. It's getting confusing for B-Lab. What do we recognize? What do we don't? It's getting confusing for companies. What if you have overlap of, or if you have multiple benchmark options in one location? Which one do you choose? So here's a small list of how the benchmarks vary, just to give you an understanding. Sometimes they're free. For those that work with MNCs, with multinational corporations, you may have heard from them about some paid benchmarks. The two main ones are Wage Indicator and Fair Wage Network. Similarly, some are national benchmarks. You can also have global benchmark. Global, not meaning one figure for the entire world, but covering multiple locations, multiple countries. Now, they also differ in their methodology, how much field research they do versus computation. So most of them have at least some degree of going into, for example, supermarkets, seeing what is the cost of bread, what is the cost of housing. To varying degrees, they also use computation, saying, for example, okay, we know in location A that bread costs that much. Location B is pretty similar, so let's assume the bread costs the same. To varying degrees, there's different degrees of computation that's used in the calculations. Cost categories also vary. There's consensus around things like food, housing, transport, healthcare, but there's other cost categories that tend to vary. And an example of that is childcare and of the, I forgot what the one person called it, was it rainy day fund? Yeah, or emergency money. Lastly, as I mentioned, a living wage is for a person and their family. But as we know, family sizes really do vary. So this is also where you see a difference in benchmarks. Some will say, like MIT calculator, they give options for 0, 1, 2, 3 children, and then the user chooses. Others say, well, on average, family sizes are this big, 1.7 children per family, for example, and they base their calculations on that. You'll see this funky image on the left. The reason why I included this picture of a quilt, this blanket, is because I think it captures quite well where we are at with benchmarks. We have different benchmarks, different colors, different approaches, different methodologies. They look different. But what we're seeing is by having more and more benchmarks kind of sewn together, we are getting global coverage. And now, in fact, most countries around the world have some sort of living wage data available. I want to make one thing very clear. Benchmarks are not perfect. As human beings, whenever there's complexity involved, we like it when we can simplify things, especially if we can simplify human needs down to one number. We think, great. A lot of companies will think, okay, great, I'll pay that and I'm done. But the reality is there's so much inherent complexity that benchmarks will essentially not be perfect. And don't forget that our understanding of human needs, our understanding of what constitutes a living wage is also evolving. So that's also why benchmarks will never be perfect. The advice I often give to companies is there will be moments when maybe the data doesn't quite look right. And the best thing to do is to sense check the data with workers. So sense check the data with the people who it's actually going to affect. This can be as simple as setting up a focus group and saying, look, this is the data that we have. Do you think it's right? Or you can go a step further. If there's a worker representation body, a workers union, give them the data and say, what do you think? Do you agree with this? And there are actually some good examples out there of unions using benchmark data to improve the negotiation position when negotiating wages with either management or with a company. So those two working hand in hand is generally something that we recommend. So let's look at where companies are now. What you have on your screen is the general trajectory that companies it's kind of the journey that companies go on when it comes to living wage. So they often start paying a minimum wage thinking, great, I'm following the law, I'm doing what I need to do. Then there's a realization, okay, minimum wages are often not living wages. Let me start doing that. And they will start with their employees because that's, well, it's in the sphere of influence, it's easier to do, but also there are clear commercial benefits. It increases retention, increases worker satisfaction. So that's often where companies will start. Then there's the next level, which is a supply chain, which is really, really tricky, of course. So what companies often do is they have targeted projects where they will work on making sure that the workers in the supply chain are paid a living wage. Fair Labor Association, for example, has a project where they work with their members. So I think it was Puma and Nike, for example, they have focused on specific factories in Vietnam, where they say, we're going to start here. We're going to essentially do a pilot project to see how we can get these people in these factories to get a living wage. And then they will kind of scale that out to different countries, different factories. Where we all want to head towards is something called the cost of sustainable production. This is when companies essentially develop a model for what they should charge to the consumer market based on full sustainability in the chain. And that will include making sure everyone in the chain gets paid a living wage.